There is a single date embedded deep within the architecture of this story that disrupts everything we think we know, and once its significance comes into view, it becomes impossible to unsee. For decades, the public narrative of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer has had a fixed starting point. A summer day in 1980, a 19-year-old nursery teacher in a sheer skirt standing before a flash of press cameras, and a whirlwind romance that captured the imagination of the world. Yet the decisive choices that ultimately governed her life had already been made years prior, settled in quiet rooms she had never set foot in, negotiated by senior courtiers whose names would never appear in a single tabloid headline. For the majority of his adult life, Prince William accepted the standard account of his family's history. It was a familiar, tidy, and deeply tragic tragedy, a fundamental mismatch of temperaments, a father whose heart belonged to someone else, a mother who suffered under the weight of an unyielding spotlight, and an ancient institution that did its best to manage the wreckage before quietly moving on. William grew up inside the walls of that explanation, shaping his internal world around it, and reaching a solemn form of peace with its outline. Over the past 2 decades, however, the narrative William lives with has transformed into something far more intricate and troubling. This shift was not sparked by a single explosive revelation or a classified document handed to him in secret. Instead, it unfolded slowly and cumulatively, piece by piece, drawn from the painstaking work of royal historians, the memoirs of retired advisors, and the unscripted accounts of those who occupied the corridors of power during the 1970s. When assembled, these fragments do not depict a simple romantic failure or an unfortunate personality clash. They reveal a structural design, an institutional calculus that predated Diana entirely. The truth that eventually reached William arrived too late to alter the past. It came when the key players were elderly, distant, or long dead, beyond the reach of any resolving conversation. All such a truth can do is sit heavily in the present. William did not experience a single defining epiphany that shattered his childhood, but rather a gradual realization of the calculated framework built around his family before he was even conceived, spent over 30 years deciphering its true geometry from within. As a young boy, William was surrounded by the subtle mechanics of this unspoken structure. He felt the unspoken tension hanging in rooms he was too young to fully understand, observed the deliberate care with which adults chose their words whenever certain topics drifted into view, and learned the heavy, peculiar silence that descended whenever a specific name was uttered. At 15, he watched his mother sit before a BBC camera and deliver an interview that stopped the nation in its tracks. Weeks later, he stood in the glare of a global spotlight, dressed in a tailored suit chosen for him, walking behind her coffin through the streets of central London at a cadence dictated by state protocol. In later years, when reflecting on that walk, William would repeatedly recall the sound, not just the muffled hoofbeats or the tolling bells, but the staggering, collective silence of 1 million people attempting not to make a sound. The image of a teenage boy staring down at the paving stones to keep his footing became seared into the world's memory, an image he could never fully leave behind because every historical reflection returned it to the screen. In the years following that loss, William was offered 100 polite variations of the same comforting story. Court insiders, family friends, and official biographies insisted it was simply a sad twist of fate, an unfortunate mismatch between 2 fundamentally incompatible individuals. It was an explanation that served the interests of nearly everyone around him, and as a teenager, William accepted the consensus of the adults in his room. Yet, as he matured, attending university, serving in the military, marrying, and starting a family of his own, he began to re-examine that inheritance. The difference between what William understood at 25 and what he grasps today is not merely a matter of extra historical detail. It fundamentally changes the identity of the central actors in the drama. The material reaching him from serious scholars and former palace officials pointed toward a conclusion the official history stubbornly avoids, that the breakdown of the Prince and Princess of Wales's marriage was not an unexpected disaster, but a predictable consequence of the decisions that framed it. Those who observe the Prince of Wales closely note that this realization did not manifest as outward fury, but as a deep, permanent stillness, the quiet posture of a man who has ceased to be surprised by the machinery of his own lineage. When Diana Spencer entered the royal orbit in 1980, she possessed every attribute the palace had spent years seeking. At 19, she carried flawless aristocratic pedigree on both sides of her family, a requirement that held far more weight behind closed doors than anyone publicly admitted. She possessed an intuitive, natural warmth in front of crowds that could not be coached, paired with an extraordinary visual presence that would quickly prove to be both a blessing and a burden. By every traditional metric applied by the monarchy for over a century, she was the ideal candidate for the role of future queen. Yet private accounts from those who observed her during those early months describe a reality starkly at odds with the emerging public fairy tale. Diana was neither overly dramatic nor imagining threats. She had stepped into an established household and discovered an emotional void she could neither enter nor fill, surrounding a fiancé who refused to acknowledge its existence. This underlying tension crystallized in a specific moment preserved across multiple accounts and confirmed by Diana herself in recorded interviews. Shortly before the royal wedding, she discovered a custom pair of gold cufflinks intended as a gift for Charles. Engraved upon them were two interwoven initials, not his own, nor a royal cipher, but the initials of another woman. It was a tangible revelation of her fiancé's private life that no briefing from senior advisors had prepared her to navigate. Rather than making a public scene, Diana raised the matter privately and directly with Charles. He offered no denial, no comfort, and no reassurance. Instead, he responded with a profound silence, a response that spoke far more clearly than any formal explanation could. At 19, just weeks away from spectacle watched by hundreds of millions, she found herself holding those cufflinks in a palace where every staff member was loyal to the institution rather than to her. The presence that cast a shadow over Diana's new life held no official title, no court appointment, and no formal standing. Camilla Parker Bowles was simply an undeniable constant, present at private gatherings, at the end of telephone calls, and reflected in the subtle shift in Charles's demeanor whenever her name arose. Diana possessed a sharp perceptive intelligence that many who underestimated her youth failed to grasp. She began assembling the reality of her position entirely alone, without a single figure in the royal household willing to validate what she was seeing. The palace had selected her for the role, yet it offered her no tools to understand the environment she had been placed in. The emotional isolation of those first 2 years was profound. A teenager living inside a working royal residence, surrounded by legacy staff who reported to the household hierarchy, married to a husband frequently away on official duties, and pursued by a relentless press corps outside the gates. Whenever she attempted to seek clarity from those around her, she was met with gentle sympathy, warm reassurances, and the subtle implication that her anxieties were merely the product of fatigue, youth, or the overwhelming adjustment to royal life. To understand how this dynamic was established, the narrative must reach back past the wedding, past the engagement, and past Diana's first introduction to the royal court. It extends back to the early 1970s, when a young Prince of Wales was informed by the institution into which he was born that the woman he wished to pursue was not considered an acceptable candidate for marriage. Charles and Camilla had met around 1970 within their shared social circles, establishing an immediate and authentic connection. Contemporaries from that era consistently note that Camilla possessed a unique ability to make Charles feel comfortable within himself, a rare state for a young man burdened by immense expectation. She brought warmth where his world demanded strict formality, lightheartedness where deference was expected, and related to him as an individual rather than as the heir to the throne. However, by the rigid standards maintained by palace advisors in the early 1970s, these personal qualities counted for very little. Camilla was deemed unsuited for the role of queen consort. The unwritten requirements of the era were absolute. A candidate required a spotless romantic past, a background conditioned by royal discipline, and a willingness to conform to institutional expectations. The distinction drawn by senior advisors at the time was exceptionally cold. Camilla was viewed as a suitable companion for a prince's youth, but not the woman to wear the crown. Charles did not yield to this assessment immediately. Accounts from a period describe a young man who argued, delayed, and sought a compromise that would allow both his personal desires and his royal duties to coexist. But the institutional machinery does not engage in single debates it might lose. It operates through steady, inexorable pressure, outlasting individual resistance by leveraging centuries of tradition. Charles was subsequently deployed on active service with the Royal Navy, allowing physical distance to complete the separation. In July 1973, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles at the Guards Chapel in London, and the advisors who had managed the scenario considered the matter closed. The institution had not issued a direct command. It had simply structured circumstances so that only one path remained, allowing the outcome to appear as a personal choice, while overlooking the inevitable consequences of asking a man to abandon an attachment he had never truly relinquished. The consequences of that unyielding decision took roughly 5 years to manifest, revealing a systematic form of deception that relied entirely on omission rather than outright falsehoods. Within the household of the Prince and Princess of Wales throughout the 1980s, this dynamic operated as an accepted structural reality, not a clandestine secret in the traditional sense, but an undeniable presence that was simply never spoken of in front of Diana. Observers who moved through royal circles during that decade describe an eerie atmosphere where Charles and Diana maintained a shared public life of synchronized engagements, identical photographs, and choreographed public appearances, while the emotional foundations of their union had long since been undermined. Biographer Penny Junor, drawing on extensive access to insiders from that era, placed the rekindling of the relationship between Charles and Camilla around 1978 or 1979, years before Diana's name was ever introduced to palace selection committees. While other researchers offer slightly differing timelines, the broader trajectory remains unchallenged. By the time a 19-year-old bride was being fitted for her wedding dress, the romance officially declared closed in 1973 was actively thriving once more. This chronological sequence is the cornerstone of the entire narrative. The official narrative presented to the British public for over a decade depended entirely on the reverse timeline, the illusion of a marriage that failed organically first, driving a disillusioned husband to seek comfort elsewhere later. Reversing that order transforms the nature of the story completely. Meanwhile, Andrew Parker Bowles remained largely unbothered by the rekindled dynamic, embodying an attitude characteristic of his social class and era, choosing to accept the complexities of his milieu rather than instigating a public scandal. This context reframes the significance of the monogrammed cufflinks Diana had discovered. They were not an accidental oversight, but a tangible symbol of a connection preserved and honored right up to the threshold of a new marriage. Following her quiet confrontation over the cufflinks, Diana's most explosive public confrontation took place away from her husband, occurring instead at a private gathering where she directly addressed Camilla in front of witnesses. In a quiet, devastatingly plain sentence, she voiced the reality they all inhabited. She requested her husband back while apologizing for being in the way. It remains the single documented instance where the two women confronted each other without the buffer of advisors, public relations teams, or formal statements. Diana walked out of that room and continued her duties, maintaining her public schedule for another 12 years without missing a beat. Beyond these interpersonal collisions lies a deeper institutional reality uncovered by historians working independently over decades. Senior royal advisors, tasked solely with ensuring the long-term survival of the monarchy, had conducted comprehensive assessments of Charles's attachment to Camilla long before Diana entered the picture. They understood the depth of his feelings, and according to emerging records, at least some of those officials privately concluded that a traditional marriage alone would not sever that bond. Consequently, the very qualities that made Diana the ideal candidate on paper, her youth, her sheltered background, her lack of a complicated romantic history, and her malleability, also render her uniquely unequipped to survive the reality she was walking into. The palace was not seeking a compatible partner for the future king. It was engineering a manageable scenario. While no smoking gun memorandum has surfaced to explicitly prove premeditation, the underlying pattern is unmistakable. Whenever individual emotional reality has clashed with institutional continuity, the institution has consistently prioritized self-preservation, managing the human cost quietly behind closed doors. Diana was managed from the very beginning. At 19, she was subjected to background checks, temperament assessments, and suitability reviews conducted by middle-aged courtiers, all while an internal awareness of Charles's true attachments hummed in the background. She was never asked whether she would have proceeded with the match had she known the complete truth, largely because the wedding date was already set and the institution required a specific outcome. The cold axiom governing the entire arrangement remained absolute. Camilla was the woman to love, but Diana was the woman to marry. Yet Diana's instincts proved remarkably accurate from the outset. For a decade, she was gaslit by her environment, repeatedly told her anxieties were unfounded paranoia, until the accumulation of strain forced her to seek an outlet. When she ultimately chose to cooperate with Andrew Morton for his 1992 biography, the decision was not an impulsive reaction, but a calculated act of self-preservation. She recorded her testimony in complete isolation, deliberately choosing what to reveal and what to hold back as a safeguard against expected institutional retaliation. The expected backlash arrived swiftly. Her official office was downsized, her royal patronage and title status came under intense review, and her security details were restructured just as global media scrutiny reached a fever pitch. Each punitive measure was formally packaged as a routine administrative consequence of the royal separation, but in sequence, they resembled a systematic effort to strip away her institutional protection. Her landmark November 1995 Panorama interview with Martin Bashir, watched by nearly 23 million Britons, was her direct response to that isolation. While subsequent independent inquiries, notably Lord Dyson's 2021 report, confirmed that deceptive methods were used by the BBC to secure the interview, the authenticity of Diana's words remains distinct from the journalistic misconduct that facilitated them. She used her hour on television to articulate the stark reality of a three-person marriage, validating the lived experience she had been pressured to deny for 14 years. The emotional fallout of these events cascaded directly down to her sons. When Diana died in 1997, Prince William was 15, old enough to comprehend the totality of the loss, yet young enough to be shielded by well-meaning adults who believed difficult conversations could be indefinitely postponed. That anticipated window for honest reckoning never truly opened. While William and his father subsequently forged a genuine, respectful working relationship rooted in a shared understanding of extraordinary public pressure, the foundational silence surrounding the past remained untouched. The two men have stood side by side through countless public commemorations, statue unveilings, and anniversaries without ever publicly or privately untangling the full architecture of what occurred. As King Charles faces his own health challenges, the finite nature of time casts a heavy shadow over these unaddressed realities, intensifying the quiet weight William carries as he prepares to inherit the throne. The moment the private realities of the royal family finally breached the fortress of public relations, the transformation was total and irreversible. That night in 1995 did not merely mark the airing of an interview. It signified the moment the institution permanently lost control of its own narrative. The public response revealed a stark divide. The version of events meticulously maintained by palace press offices for over a decade had unspooled, replaced by a picture of the marriage that millions of people had already quietly assembled for themselves. Internationally, the narrative shifted overnight. The fairy tale was discarded in favor of a much colder, more cynical story about institutional self-preservation. Inside Britain, it sparked a fundamental question about what the monarchy was for and whose interests it was ultimately built to protect. The palace answered that crisis with the most sophisticated long-term public relations campaign in modern royal history. The rehabilitation of Camilla from tabloid villain to accepted royal figure was neither accidental nor swift. It was a masterclass in slow, calibrated exposure. Charles and Camilla were married in a quiet civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall on April 9, 2005. By that time, the strategy had already largely succeeded. The method was identical to the strategy employed in 1973, simply applied in reverse. The palace issued no defensive statements and forced no arguments. Instead, it placed Camilla in the room a little more often each year, alongside uncontroversial causes, and waited for time to do the rest. The same machine that once maneuvered to separate the couple spent 20 years quietly reconditioning the public to accept them. The only entity that never received an explanation or an apology was the woman who had paid the original price for those institutional maneuvers, a woman whose absence made the eventual rehabilitation infinitely easier to execute. This entire sequence of events converges on the coronation of King Charles III on May 6, 2023. By every formal metric, the ceremony was a triumphant display of ancient symbolism and flawless choreography. Yet for those watching Prince William, the day carried a very different emotional resonance. William met every ceremonial requirement with the steady discipline that has defined his public life. He stood where directed, swore his allegiance, and carried the weight of the moment with unyielding dignity. Yet observers noted subtle cracks in the composure, fractions of a second where his gaze drifted past the spectacle, a set of the jaw that betrayed the immense internal effort required to maintain complete stillness. Throughout the elaborate proceedings, Diana was never mentioned. The first Princess of Wales of the modern era, whose death had brought the country to a standstill, was absent from the official order of service. That absence was not an oversight, It was a deliberate choice made in planning meetings by senior officials, reflecting the same old institutional instinct that Diana remains a complication best handled by silence. Yet she remained present in the Abbey nonetheless, occupying the quiet space around her name. William watched a crown placed upon Camilla's head, keeping his thoughts entirely to himself. He had learned the ultimate lesson of his youth by observing both of his parents. His mother spoke out and lost her title, her office, and her protection. His father remained silent for 30 years and received everything he desired. When the history is stripped of sentimentality, the basic facts remain unassailable. Charles obtained the outcome he had sought for half a century. The institution that once deemed Camilla unsuitable eventually placed a crown on her head. For her part, Camilla endured years of intense public hostility with patience and silence, gradually earning her place within the royal apparatus through sheer endurance. Yet this ultimate resolution exposes the hypocrisy of the original judgment made in the early 1970s. If Camilla was entirely capable of fulfilling the role of queen consort all along, as her subsequent decades of service demonstrate, then the rigid rule that denied her in 1973 was not an absolute law of state. It was an arbitrary standard enforced by courtiers, quietly abandoned the moment it became inconvenient to maintain. That single arbitrary decision exacted a tragic human cost across 3 lives. Charles spent decades trapped in arranged marriage and secret relationship. Camilla spent decades as a national pariah, and Diana lived and died inside a tragic play whose opening act had been hidden from her. Diana was never the wrong wife because of her character or her background. She was simply chosen to serve as the institutional cover story while the palace bought time. Today, William carries the ultimate legacy of that history. He lives with a profound love for his father, enduring grief for his mother, and an intimate understanding of how those two realities were engineered by the machine he is destined to head. He will eventually take the crown, stepping into the legacy of an institution whose mechanics he understands more completely and more painfully than any heir before him. He will serve it faithfully because that is the obligation built into his bloodline. Yet every decision he makes in raising his own family and structuring his own household reflects a silent, permanent rejection of the old ways. He remains the ultimate witness to the story, walking forward with a quiet, irreversible knowledge of what it costs to build the crown he will one day wear.